It started with a letter, an official-looking envelope that arrived on an otherwise unremarkable morning. Inside, a legal document declared him the sole inheritor of an antique shop belonging to a distant relative, someone he barely remembered. The thought of it was strange enough, but what unsettled him most was the way people reacted when he mentioned the shop. Their faces tensed, their voices lowered, and their words became hesitant. No one said it outright, but there was something about that place that filled them with fear. The first time he stepped inside, the air felt thick, as if the shop itself was holding its breath. Dust floated in the dim light, swirling lazily as if disturbed by unseen movement. The wooden floor creaked under his weight, but not just beneath his feet. Somewhere in the back, another board groaned, as if someone, or something, was shifting in the darkness. The shelves were cluttered with relics from forgotten eras, each one carrying a presence, an aura that felt almost watchful. There was an old bell above the door, its metal rusted, its ring muted as if strangled by time. The moment he crossed the threshold, a shiver ran down his spine, a primitive warning from something deep in his bones. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the eerie atmosphere, the weight of decades pressing in on him. But there was more to it than that. He could feel it. The shop wasn't just a collection of objects. It was something else, something alive. That night, he dreamt of whispers, low, urgent voices murmuring in languages he didn't understand. He saw flashes of faces, distorted and wide-eyed, mouths frozen in silent screams. He woke up in a cold sweat, heart hammering, the shadows in his bedroom stretching unnaturally across the walls. When morning came, he told himself it was nothing more than a nightmare. But when he returned to the shop, he noticed something strange. Objects had moved, not slightly. Entire shelves had shifted, items rearranged in a pattern he didn't recognize. As he ran his fingers over the glass display cases, an unsettling thought crept into his mind. What had his relative really been doing here? What kind of business had he been running? And why had no one told him what he was truly inheriting? The deeper he looked, the clearer it became. This was no ordinary antique store. It was something much, much worse. The deeper he delved into the shop's collection, the more he realized these weren't ordinary antiques. Each item had a presence, a weight that went beyond its age. An old journal, tucked away in a locked cabinet, contained frantic scribbles detailing the history of certain objects, who had owned them, how they had died, and the strange occurrences that followed each possession. The handwriting became more erratic with every page, the final entry scrawled in trembling letters. They are not just things. They remember. One object in particular sent a chill through his bones, a tarnished mirror, its frame intricately carved with symbols he didn't recognize. The moment he looked into it, his reflection lagged, hesitating just a fraction too long before mimicking his movements. He leaned in closer, his breath fogging the glass. And then it happened. His reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate grin, though his own lips hadn't moved. He stumbled back, heart pounding, but the mirror remained unchanged, its surface rippling for just a moment, as if something beneath was waiting. There was a clock, its wooden case chipped and worn, its hands frozen at 3:13. No matter how many times he tried to wind it, the time never changed. Yet, at precisely 3:13 each night, the soft chime of its bells echoed through the shop, even though the mechanism was broken. Once, he caught sight of a figure in the reflection of its glass cover, a tall, gaunt shape lurking just beyond the shelves. When he turned, there was nothing there, only the endless rows of cursed artifacts. And then the doll. It sat among a collection of old toys, its porcelain face cracked, its blue glass eyes too lifelike, too knowing. He dismissed the unease at first, until he found it moved. At night, he locked it inside a display case, only to wake and find it resting on the counter, its tiny hands positioned as if it had been waiting for him. He told himself it must have fallen, must have been misplaced. But deep down, he knew better. Every object in that store had a history, a lingering essence of something that refused to fade. And yet, against his better judgment, he made a decision, one that would set everything into motion. If these items had value, then they could be sold. If people wanted to buy them, Who was he to deny them? After all, they were just things, weren't they? The first sale was almost an accident. A collector, a wiry man with restless hands, had wandered into the shop, eyes gleaming as they traced over the shelves. He fixated on a peculiar item, a black cane with a silver wolf's head, its surface worn smooth by time. Exquisite, the man murmured, his fingers brushing over the intricate carvings on the handle. There was something about his eagerness that unsettled the shop's new owner, but he pushed the feeling aside. The man paid in cash, barely looking up as he exited the store. 2 days later, the news came. The collector had been found in his home, his body contorted in an unnatural position, bones snapped as if something had crushed him from the inside. The official report cited an accident, some kind of freak mishap, but the store owner knew better. He remembered the way the cane had felt in his hands, the strange warmth of the metal, as if it pulsed beneath his fingers. He had sold more than an antique. He had handed over a curse. The second sale was to a woman who had been drawn to a delicate gold locket, its design simple yet hypnotic. "It reminds me of something," she had murmured, staring into its tiny glass window. The moment she fastened it around her neck, a shudder ran through her body. She hesitated, almost as if she'd changed her mind, but then forced a smile and left. The next morning, she called the shop, her voice thin, trembling. "There's something in my room," she whispered. "I keep seeing a woman in the mirror. She looks like me, but she's smiling when I'm not." The call cut out. Hours later, her landlord found her apartment abandoned, the locket still lying on her pillow, its glass cracked from the inside. The police labeled her disappearance a missing persons case, but the shopkeeper knew she hadn't left, not in the way they thought. The deaths and disappearances kept coming. A man who had purchased an old violin was found hanging by its strings, his face twisted in terror. A child who had taken home a wind-up music box screamed for nights, claiming a voice inside was talking to him, until his parents destroyed it, only to find it mysteriously whole the next morning. Panic clawed at the shopkeeper's mind. He had assumed these were just stories, myths tangled up in superstition. But this was real. Every item he sold carried something with it, something eager, something hungry. He told himself he would stop, that he wouldn't sell another cursed thing. But as he locked the store for the night, the weight of unseen eyes pressed against his back, and deep inside the shop, an old clock choked out its hollow chime. 3:13 again. Desperation led him deeper into the shop's secrets. He tore through dusty ledgers, old letters, and handwritten notes left behind by his deceased relative. The deeper he read, the more the truth slithered into place. This was never just a shop. It was a vault, a prison, a place built to contain things that should never be set free. Every object was a lock, and with every sale, he had unwittingly turned a key. One letter stood out. Its edges were burnt, its ink smudged as if the writer had been trembling. The cost must be paid. The words repeated over and over, filling the page in frantic scrawls. The final line sent a chill through his spine. If you sell what is bound, you must take its place. His hand shook as he turned the paper over, revealing a symbol drawn in dark, faded stains, blood. In the back of the shop, he discovered a hidden door, one he had never noticed before. It was different from the others, its surface smooth, untouched by dust or time. As his fingers brushed against it, a whisper, soft yet urgent, brushed against his ear. "Don't." His breath hitched. He turned, but the shop was empty. Heart pounding, he pushed the door open. Inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, each lined with jars. Not antiques, not artifacts. Names, hundreds of them, written on slips of parchment, each carefully sealed away. Some were faded, as if their souls had long been consumed. Others still looked fresh, vibrant with lingering life. At the very center stood a pedestal, an old ledger resting atop it. He flipped it open. The last name written was his own. The room pulsed with an unnatural energy. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones. He was never meant to inherit this shop. He was meant to replace the last keeper. His relative hadn't left this to him as a gift. It had been a trap, A cold weight settled in his stomach as he realized the full horror of his situation. The only way to break free would be to undo the sails. But before he could even consider how, the lights flickered. The door behind him creaked as if someone had just stepped inside. And this time, he wasn't alone. The first sign that something was wrong, truly, inescapably wrong, was the cold. Not the ordinary chill of night, but a deep, marrow-gnawing emptiness that seeped into his bones. It clung to him as he stepped back from the ledger, his name still staring at him from the page. The air thickened, pressing down on him as if unseen hands were coiling around his throat. And then came the sound, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to belong to anything still human. He turned, expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the doorway. But the space was empty, save for the flickering bulb that cast erratic shadows against the walls. Shadows that moved. His breath caught in his throat. The outlines stretched unnaturally, peeling away from their objects like living things, skittering toward him in the dim glow. He stumbled back, the names in the jars rattling, as if whatever force bound them was beginning to slip. His mind screamed at him to run, but the shop was a labyrinth, each aisle twisting in on itself like an Escher nightmare. No matter which way he turned, the shelves seemed to shift, closing in, rerouting his escape. The air was filled with whispers now, some begging, some laughing, some hungry. He felt hands that weren't their brush against his skin, tugging at the fabric of his shirt, pulling him back. Then the phone rang, a shrill, unnatural sound that cut through the murmuring dark. He lunged for it, his hands slick with sweat. "Hello." His voice was hoarse, breathless. A pause. Then a voice, not quite human, yet somehow familiar. "You broke the seal. You set them free." The words were barely above a whisper, yet they echoed in his skull, hammering against his sanity. The line crackled, and the voice grew distant, distorted. "You must feed the shop, or it will feed on you." The call cut off. Silence rushed in, heavier than before. And then, behind him, the soft chime of the broken clock. 3:13 again. A realization settled in his gut, heavy and undeniable. The shop was awake now, and it wanted him. He ran, or at least, he tried. The aisles twisted in ways that defied reason, shifting like a living thing determined to keep him trapped. The door, his only way out, moved. One moment it was right ahead, just beyond the display cases. The next, it had disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the endless corridors of cursed relics. The shop wasn't just a place anymore. It was a thing, and it was playing with him. His breathing was ragged, his pulse hammering in his skull. He turned a corner and came face to face with the mirror, the same one that had smiled at him before. But this time, the reflection didn't just smile. It stepped forward. He staggered back, knocking over a display case, the glass shattering at his feet. But in the reflection, the other version of himself didn't move. It just watched, eyes too dark, too hollow, not his. The lights flickered, casting the shop in stuttering darkness. Shapes moved between the flashes, figures shifting between the shelves, darting behind furniture, watching from the edges of the light. He felt them more than he saw them. Whispers rose from every direction, a chorus of voices too many to count. Some begged, some mocked, and some were angry. A scraping noise behind him. Slow, rhythmic, closer. He turned and saw it, a silhouette, taller than any man, limbs stretched wrong, its face just a blur of shifting darkness. It reached for him. He bolted, knocking over stacks of old books, sending artifacts crashing to the floor. He swore he heard the shop groan in response, like a beast stirring from its slumber. He had to get out, had to find a way to break whatever this was. But as he rounded another corner, the door was there, wide open, a sliver of the outside world beckoning him. He lunged forward, but something caught him. An invisible force yanked him back, slamming him against a shelf. He gasped, pain blooming in his ribs. And then, he heard the bell above the entrance ring, but not as if someone had entered, as if someone had left. A cold realization slithered down his spine. He wasn't sure if he was still inside, or if he was now looking in from the outside. The bell rang again, its chime thin and distant, as if swallowed by the shop itself. He turned toward the entrance, expecting to see the open door, his escape, but it was gone. In its place stood a man, tall, gaunt, draped in a dark coat that seemed to drink in the light. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, but his presence carried a weight, something far older than the shop itself. The man strode forward, his footsteps making no sound against the wooden floor. "You've done well," he said, his voice smooth, unsettlingly familiar. "The shop has been waiting for you." He reached into his pocket, pulling out something small, something ancient, a rusted key, darkened with age. He extended it, his gloved fingers curling around the air like talons. The shopkeeper took a step back. "Who are you?" His voice barely rose above a whisper. The man tilted his head, almost amused. "I am the same as the one before you, and the one before him. The keeper, the caretaker, the cost." He placed a key on the counter, sliding it forward. "You cannot leave," he said simply. "You were never meant to. The shop has chosen you." His breath came short, panic seizing his chest. "No," he muttered. "No, I never." The lights flickered violently, shadows stretching across the walls. The objects on the shelves shifted, as if reacting to the conversation. The jars of names rattled. Something unseen exhaled a long, slow breath. The man smiled, teeth too white, too sharp. "If you refuse, the shop will take what it's owed." He gestured around them. "You sold its seals. You must replace them. Unless—" he let the word hang in the air. "Unless what?" A low chuckle. "Unless you find another." The words settled into his skin like ice. Find another. Someone else to take his place. Someone to inherit the curse, just as it had been passed down to him. His stomach twisted. It was a choice, but was it really? The man in the dark coat turned, stepping toward the door. "I'll return soon," he said over his shoulder. "The shop will let you know when it's time." Then, just like that, he was gone. And the shopkeeper? He was left standing alone. Or maybe not alone at all. The shop was silent, but it was a silence that watched. It pressed against him, curling around his throat like invisible fingers, reminding him that he had never truly been alone. Not since the moment he had stepped inside. Not since he had sold the first cursed artifact. And now, the choice lay before him like an open grave. Find another, or become the next keeper. He spent days, weeks, searching for an answer, some loophole that would break the cycle. But every time he tried to leave, the shop refused to let him go. The streets outside led him back to the entrance, no matter which direction he walked. The phone calls he made never connected. The letters he sent were returned unopened, as if the world outside had forgotten him. It was as if the shop had already begun erasing his existence. Then, one evening, the bell above the door rang. A young man entered, curious, unsuspecting, eyes full of wonder. "I saw the sign outside," he said. "Didn't even realize this place was here before." His fingers trailed over the glass cases, his gaze lingering on the same ledger that had once held his name. The air in the shop shifted, tightening, waiting. The shopkeeper hesitated. His throat was dry, his heartbeat loud in his ears. He could warn him. He could tell him to leave and never look back. But then, the lights flickered. The whispers rose. The shop was growing impatient. He swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "We have a lot of rare items here," he said, his voice steady despite the dread clawing at his ribs. "Let me show you something interesting." As he turned toward the shelves, he caught sight of his own reflection in the mirror. It was still watching, still smiling, still waiting, and the clock behind him, chiming its cursed, inevitable toll, slowly ticked over to 3:13.